So with the news of the tornado that just hit several days ago in Virginia Beach, it's a big one, I thought it would be a good time to talk about an overview of what weather is like in Virginia Beach because people that come here from other parts of the country and the world, they're not sure really what to make of it because there are so many question marks and potential weather systems and storms that could really come up and become a big problem. And is it enough to where you might not want to live in this area because there's so many weather issues? So I'm going to talk to you about what each month and what life is like here when it comes to weather, so you feel like you're walking in here with eyes wide open before you make any decisions. Hey, my name is Sam Santalone and I'm a real estate agent in the Hampton Roads area, and that includes Virginia Beach and goes through Williamsburg, and I do videos every week about living and moving to the area. So I want to do a full overview of what weather is like in Virginia Beach. So we're going to start with the month of January. And so I'm a local here, and so I've lived about almost 40 Januaries here. And I can tell you right now that January is one of the coldest months of the year. Shocker. But if you'll notice that in January and going into the winter months, it's not super cold. So if you're coming from like Chicago, if you're coming from like anywhere in the Northeast, if you hear me talk about cold and it being in the 30s and 40s, you might laugh because it really isn't that cold compared to what you might be used to. But on the flip side, if you're coming from the South, this is still pretty cold. So for example, in January, it's typical for high temperatures to be in the 40s, and there's a long stretch of time between January going into the future months where it will be in the 40s and it will feel just kind of dismal, honestly. And so winter depression becomes a thing. You know, you're going to be wearing multiple layers if you get cold quickly. Low temperatures get into the 30s, and they can really for about 2 to 3 weeks get into the 20s, and it will feel like actual true winter. But if you notice, I haven't mentioned anything about snow. Snow is not very common here, and so you might get snow once every 2-3 years. You might get a dusting every a year or two, maybe an inch or two, but it's not super significant. Every probably 5 to 10 years, we'll get maybe a 5 to 7 inch storm. But again, anything from the north, you're not going to really think this is much of a storm, but it's enough to close streets all across the area, Virginia Beach through Williamsburg. So that's the biggest thing to note here, is that if you do come here knowing snow is coming, driving around town is the worst just because of other people here that don't really know how to drive around in the snow and the ice that can form because of the snow. So not really a huge concern here, but that's the biggest issue, is driving around other people that don't know what they're doing. I've had times in January where it's been the 50s and the 60s. I've even played golf on New Year's Day in 70-degree weather. So it can happen, and we'll have random spurts of heat, quote unquote, in January, and then it'll go back into the 40s and sometimes in the 30s and 50s. It just kind of ranges from there. For the most part, it starts dipping into the 40s and 30s regularly in January. Now it shifts us over into February, where it's a lot of the same, but it gets colder. February to me is probably the coldest month, or the month I can really be confident that it's going to be cold in. It can be more so into the 30s and sometimes even more into the 20s, but you very rarely will see it go into the 60s and 70s like I've mentioned can happen in January, but it can happen. There's still a big range of temperatures, but you're going to see a little bit colder average in February, and then as you go into the end of February, it starts getting back warmer again. The one thing you notice too is that in January and February, the air is extremely dry, and even really in most of the winter time, it's very dry, and because of that, you're going to have, like when you put your finger on your car door, you'll get shocked. Super irritating. That's one thing. Another thing is you get really dry skin a lot of times, and so it gets itchy. So that's a factor that can come in wintertime as well, especially in January and February. Now I want to stop right now and talk about nor'easters first before we get too far into the rest of the seasons, because nor'easters are something that is often not talked about, because people often think about hurricanes when they think about this area, but not nor'easters. Nor'easters feel very similar to what hurricanes feel like here. But it's more in the fall and winter time, and so it brings a lot of rain, a lot of wind, not necessarily to the same extreme as what you might see in a hurricane making landfall on a coastline, but you'll find we'll have nor'easters every few years. 50, 60, 70 mile an hour winds is not uncommon, but it just dumps a lot of rain, and so flooding can be more of an issue in the very high prone flood areas. Now, as we go into March though, it starts getting really weird. If you've never been here in March is like a total crapshoot. We don't know what to expect in March. It's almost like March, the winds below. March is wild. So you'll have the first week and a half, you'll have temperatures still in the 40s, sometimes in the 30s. It's like frigid. Like, is winter going to end this year? Yes, it will. Usually it's the second to third week of March where you start seeing it creep back up in the 40s, swing into the 50s, and all of a sudden you'll see a push of warm 60s and 70s. Like, oh, okay, here's where spring is. And so that's the randomness of March. It's very windy. It's a lot of variables, rain, sun, all of it. You'll get all of it in March, and you really won't know what to make of what to expect in the next few months. I used to play baseball. I played baseball like when I was a kid, 5, 10, 15 years old. And so baseball practice always started in the first week or so of March. And I always associated baseball with spring. But that first week of March is so cold. Going to baseball practice was miserable. And it was kind of a weird dichotomy in my mind where, like, it's supposed to be springtime, but I'm also wearing 2 to 3 layers of clothes. And you'll see about into the third-ish week of March, you'll you'll go from trees being barren, no leaves, to all of a sudden, like one day, you'll look and you're like, oh my gosh, it's springtime. It's like, that's how fast things change here. And especially as if the weather gets too warm too fast, you'll start seeing pollen and the blooms of flowers start forming a lot sooner as well, which that's the one thing I want to mention now is the pollen. As we get into the April time period, the pollen here is so thick. If you drive a dark colored car, if you struggle with allergies, this is the biggest time of year for pollen. It comes so thick and so fast, and it's like, you'll see it kind of floating in the air. It's different types of pollen too. We're actually ranked in the top 10 for weed pollen and grass pollen in the country. So if you do come here and you have allergies, this is one thing I do strongly caution you on, is being prepared for the allergies. Your head getting red, your eyes getting bloodshot, just all the congestion in your face, just feeling crap. It happens a lot here. I never grew up with allergies, but in the last 2-3 years, I've felt it even in my face in the last couple of years. And so I know just a little taste of what I think it feels like, but I know a lot of people that really struggle with this. And so it's a big deal here. And I don't think this is talked about enough. And so once you get into April, going into the rest of the springtime, this pollen situation is real. And so you have to wash your cars more frequently. You've got to just clean your clothes just to make sure it's not getting into the air and getting into your head and your system. But it's real. And so if you do struggle with allergies, this is a big caution. Now that we're going to get into the April time period, separate from the pollen, this is the time when you'll start really feeling like spring's coming. Now, spring could look like 70, 80 degrees in April. It could also look like 50s and 40s in April sometimes too. It does happen. But most of the time, you're going to see things in the 60s, and you'll start seeing temperatures bump up into the 70s sometimes, especially near Easter. It just feels more like springtime. And you'll start seeing more rain. Now, that shifts us into May, which is generally speaking one of the nicest months of the year. Most of the time, it's not too humid. It's usually in the 70s. It's great. And you have like windows open. It's real nice and breezy, and it's not super uncomfortable. Now, I've seen years where in May, it's rained almost the entire month, and it's been the 50s. So it's not always like this. So there's still that randomness you'll find with a lot of months in Hampton Roads and Virginia Beach. And so especially in May, this can happen. But for the most part, this is one of the nicest months of the year. It rivals other months in the fall that I think are some of my favorites. And you won't really see the big heat punch that you're going to get here pretty soon as you get into June. Now, June is the one where, now the question often comes with, what about tornadoes? You talked about tornadoes, Sam. And recently we had a tornado this past couple weeks ago that was an F3 in Virginia Beach. Now, the reason I mention this is because it is very uncommon for tornadoes to hit in Virginia Beach or even really through Hampton Roads. So this is one of the biggest ones we've ever seen, and it created a lot of damage in a very specific part of town. But this is not a common thing. So if you're worried about tornadoes, if you're coming from the Midwest or an area that has more of these, this is a very uncommon thing. You'll get the first real big smack of summertime, but the humidity starts coming. And it can come in a vengeance. You'll see go from dry in the wintertime to real hot, muggy could be anywhere from the early part of June into the late part of June. You'll start seeing a change at some point, but you just don't know when. And it's uncomfortable. You'll see some Junes, like last year, June was quite nice in the 70s and sometimes a little bit in the 80s. But there are times like when I got married, it was pushing 90, low 90s and humid. And so it can be real uncomfortable in late June. And now in June, you'll start seeing more like severe weather, thunderstorms. Like you'll start every once in a while, hail will come in those thunderstorms as well. We saw that once last year. It had some like dime size hail, but a lot of wind in those thunderstorms, but they happen, once every, 3 or 4 weeks, you might get one. Not a big problem, but you might lose some power is probably the biggest issue with those things. And so if you have a lot of houses built like 50, 60, 70 years ago, you'll still see parts of the area that have power lines above ground. And so with that, you'll have a lot of trees, well-developed trees. And when those trees fall, you'll see more power outages. So in the places with those older houses, Little Neck, Great Neck, in parts of central Virginia Beach, you'll still see a decent amount of power outages because one of the reasons is because of that. So areas in those parts of town, you might see more generators, for example. And if you have one, it's probably a good idea, but it's not mandatory. You might go years without ever needing it. But in June, with the severe thunderstorms, that can happen. But the conversation shifts to the first part of the hurricane season. And so in Virginia Beach through Williamsburg, there's always a conversation about the hurricanes, but it's not very strong. People over time have just gotten used to the idea of hurricanes, but it never really becomes a really big threat here to where you have to prepare every year for some imminent danger. The reason being is because if you look on the maps, you'll see that Virginia Beach through Williamsburg is kind of protected by the south along North Carolina and South Carolina. That area there kind of jets out into the ocean and protects the Hampton Roads area from hurricanes that come from the southeast. And so as hurricanes come, they come into the southeast, and as they get pulled up into a system, a low pressure system, they start going north. But by the time they go to us, usually the eye wall has hit any part of the southeast, and the strength of the hurricane has lessened quite a bit. So if you see a category 1, 2, or 3 storm hit the coast, by the time it gets to us, it's more like a tropical storm. Category 1, maybe even 2, but usually it's like 1 or a tropical storm. Now, what you want to do to get an idea of how bad hurricanes have been, like the worst of them, is ask neighbors or locals if you're planning to move here and you're trying to see like what that specific area was like in the worst parts of any storms that have come recently. Ask people, neighbors, what was it like in Hurricane Matthew, which hit in 2016, which had a lot of flooding in very specific spots, but a lot of rain. This is more of a rain situation. But then also ask if they remember what it was like in Hurricane Isabel in 2003. That was the strongest windstorm I've ever seen in this area. Hurricane Isabel was the other best example of what the most extremes have been here. We haven't had a storm really come in a few years. We've had threats, and that's really the biggest thing here is the threat of it as much as the actual event itself. And that's where flooding can be a question. So if you're worried about flooding, if you're focused on that, talk to people that are living in areas you're focusing on to live and see what their experiences have been for flooding, because Virginia Beach specifically, it's very random, and most of Virginia Beach does not flood very much. Along some of the coastlines, like in the north part, a little bit near the Lesnar Bridge on the very north central side of Virginia Beach near Shore Drive, you'll see some pictures of some areas that have flooded near the coast. But even there, it's not that strong. And so it's specific spots near the ocean front have had some issues in the past. And also the central part of Virginia Beach have had issues in the past, especially with Matthew, where a neighborhood got completely decimated from bad drainage from that storm. So bad drainage can be an issue in very specific spots. So just do some research on where you'll see most of the systems. If there's flooding or concerns for a lot of rain, you'll see the rain drain out in a matter of hours or half a day or whatever, and just it's almost like nothing happened. On a regular basis, the biggest issue here is the muggy humidity. The humidity really starts smacking in the face in June as you go into July, and it is hot and uncomfortable, and so it's sticky. And so if you don't like that, between June as we go into July and August, you're going to see the worst of this. July 4th is usually pretty hot, and it's the same thing. The mugginess continues. We're going to see temperatures in the 80s and 90s regularly, and you'll see heat indexes over into the triple digits. Doesn't surprise me, and you'll see about 2-3 weeks of that. And it's just like in the wintertime when it was in the 20s and 30s for about 2-3 weeks. You'll see that hundreds heat index for about 2-3 weeks, maybe even a little bit longer than that. I'd say the summer times are worse extreme-wise than the winter times are extreme-wise. Random severe thunderstorms, but nothing too crazy. Even hurricanes really aren't on a big conversation yet. It's not until you get into the August month where You'll start seeing more questions about hurricanes or tropical systems, but even still, unless it really hits us, hurricane season keeps going, but we never really experience one. So in August, this is the surprise, still hot month of the year, and so temperatures still go into the 90s and still heat index above that. And so if you're expecting cooler, this is not the month to expect that. It still feels a lot more similar to July than you might want to believe. And also, if you love grass, if you're trying to make sure your grass stays green. Now, as we go into the school year, into September, starts getting to the peak hurricane season. So if we get anything with hurricanes, usually it is in September, maybe early October. September can still be hot. Early September, especially Labor Day, can still be like the last punch of summertime. But most of the time, you're starting to see temperatures go into the 80s, into the 70s again. It kind of ranges in that hot to nice kind of range. But that's also when you'll start seeing outdoor pools close. Labor Day is a very common day for those outdoor pools to close. Now, going into October, though, this is a very nice month. It can turn into like the equivalent of May to me in the fall, where it's like the leaves start changing, which is more for the fall, but it is also comfortable. You'll see more in the 70s, into the 60s. It starts getting a little bit cooler, that first like, ooh, winter's coming kind of thing. You'll start seeing that in October, but it's usually quite comfortable and it's not super cold. But you'll see every once in a while like a cold front come in. Maybe it's in the 50s, sometimes even in the 40s. But most of the time, October is very nice and pleasant. But if you like warm, you're starting to be a little uncomfortable in some parts of October. This is also the first month where you're starting to see less humidity and it's noticeable. So that's also why October is great, because you don't get that mugginess as much as you would in early September or into the summer months. So now we go into November. Now we're starting to get a little bit more cold, like, oh, it's getting winter again. But it's not all the way there yet. And so 50s, 40s, Thanksgiving can be anywhere from the 40s to the 70s. I've been in line at Black Friday waiting for stuff in the middle of the night, and it's been like 38 degrees. It's also been times where it's been 65, 70 degrees. So you get a big wide range here. No snow really in November. I don't know if I've ever seen snow in November, but it starts getting cold now, and the air starts getting drier. So that shift back into wintertime is officially upon us. Now we have December. December is, you assume it's going to be wintertime, but because of the randomness, the weirdness going on in weather in general, you really don't always get wintertime in December. I've had t-shirts on on Christmas Day. You're starting to see maybe if you get any snow. I think I've seen snow a few times in December, but again, it's not very strong, not a lot. And you're starting to see more like 40s and 50s, 40s and the 30s, and you're starting to get reminded more that January is coming now too. So, and also the air is getting much drier as you get into January. And so if you notice though that we don't get super extremes with climate or weather here. You won't get a lot of extremes here in the wintertime for snow, for really, really cold. The one extreme I think you'll find is that it's hot and humid for that 2.5, 3 month period in the summertime. But we don't get, the worst of the hurricanes. We don't get the worst of the severe thunderstorms and tornadoes. We just get a little bit of everything, which is similar to what Virginia Beach's MO is, which is a little bit of everything. So if you have any questions about living in Virginia Beach or relocating here, that's what I do. I wanted to focus today on the weather, but I help people relocate here from all over the world. So if you have any questions, please reach out. I have my contact information in the description. You can ask me any questions you like. And if you need help to relocate here, let me know and I'll do whatever I can to help you relocate to the area. And I will see you on the next video.